Welcome and thank you for joining us at the conversation presented by the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany. My name is Paul Grandal. I'm the director of the Writers Institute. And before I introduce our guest, Pierre Joris, I want to remind you that you can watch this and all of our archive conversations on our Writers Institute YouTube channel. You can also check us out on our website, nyswritersinstitute.org. And we also invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to keep up with the latest from the Writers Institute. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Pierre Joris, a noted poet, translator, and essayist. I consider him a colleague and had several opportunities to interview him and to hear his poetry readings over the years. He spent 21 years as an English professor at the University at Albany, retiring in 2013. He taught poetry and poetics to many students at UAlbany. He's the author, editor, and translator of more than 60 books, and he's been honored twice with the PEN Award for Translation. He was also the 2003 Berlin Prize Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. He's widely considered one of the foremost translators of avant-garde poetry into both French and English. We're going to focus today on his most recently published masterwork, a bilingual edition of German and English of Paul Celan's collected earlier poetry. It's titled Memory Rose into Threshold Speech. It was published last month by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. It's a 550-page work of extraordinary scholarship and decades-long devotion to one of the most innovative poets of the 20th century. This has been an extremely fertile and prolific stretch for Joris, who has also published a recent collection of his essays and a collection he edited called A City Full of Voices, Essays on the Work of Robert Kelly, an acclaimed contemporary poet with whom Joris studied at Bard College. I could go on and on because Pierre Joris has produced an impressive body of work. But let's get to our conversation. It's a great pleasure to see you again. Pierre, welcome.
Wonderful to see you, Paul. Hello to everybody at the Writing Center, which was a place I loved dearly in my years up there.
Yeah, thank you. I know you were deeply involved when you were on the faculty at UAlbany, and you were very much central in the poetry scene in Albany. And I love, you're in Brooklyn now, I guess. I mean, that looks like an impressive office you've got there, Pierre.
Well, I've schlepped every book I ever owned from childhood on. I have my Gustav Schwab's Klassische Greek myth story retold in German prose from when I was 8 or 9, and I still have it here. So, you know, also very nomadic over 70 years now. I have kept the books.
Yes. And this is the latest that we talked about, the Paul Celan collection, an incredible collection. We'll get to that. But I mean, I've always considered you a citizen of the world. You've taught and worked and traveled in many parts of the world. You come from Europe. You're really kind of a polymath. But I've also read in an essay you wrote that you really felt constrained growing up in Luxembourg and wanted to get to the United States. What drove you across the Atlantic, and how did you really find your voice and your calling here in the US?
Well, Luxembourg, which I call the belly button of Europe, or the lint therein, obviously can't hold you long. After high school, you go to university. In those days, there was no university in Luxembourg. So I went to Paris, family thing. I was going to study medicine because being a writer was not something that was kosher. Although I had already been hit by poetry by hearing a Celan poem, the Todesfuge, in high school. But then, as a Luxembourger, I couldn't write in the Mammeloschen, Luxembourgish, which is, now people write in it a fair amount, but in my days, there wasn't even a standardized spelling of it. So we spoke it at home, in the street, all the time. But you learned reading and writing in German and in French. And then in high school, added some English to it. My town was also called Patton Town. And every year, the American armies coming out of Spangdalen, Bitburg, would come and do a big festival for the liberation, for the Rundstedt, because we were on that stretch in the Ardennes that was liberated by General Patton.
Mm-hmm.
My father had wonderful stories of being in the forest that night, getting medications. He was a doctor from the GI, sitting with the GIs around the fire. And then there's a figure going by and who says hi. The soldier says hi. And the soldiers then say to him, hey, do you know who that was? That was General Patton. Oh my God, they didn't even stand up for him, but that was kind of the American way.
Right.
You see the glint of the pearl-handled revolver on his side. That's
right.
So there was an interest in American things given that. And I got my first job selling Reader's Digest subscriptions via those things. So I knew English,
Right.
And then I wanted to be a writer. I had to pick a language. And I was not interested in what's happening in German literature. And it wasn't really, after all, I grew up in the 50s, so Germany was not a place we looked at even, except I had the German of Celan, but I was not, at Celan. French would have been the natural language for a good Luxembourg bourgeois to write in, as many did. Many of my friends who became writers write French.
Right.
I was totally uninterested in what was happening. I thought the surrealists had been great in the 20s, but I didn't see anything except maybe Henri Michaud or one or two. But besides the American soldiers, by mistake, I bought Ginsberg's Howl in a bookshop in Luxembourg and Burroughs' Naked Lunch.
Wow.
And I was 14. I was in a bookshop, a gay bookshop that was open for 6 months before the bishop closed it down.
Oh.
And so, I was looking for erotica, clearly, at that age. But by mistake, I bought Howl and Naked Lunch. And I was completely submerged by this amazing work. And so when I was in Paris studying medicine, but really wanted to be a poet and decided to drop out, I thought, what am I going to write in? Well, I was already spending my evenings at Shakespeare and Company. And so at the Shakespeare and Company, I took Pound off the wall, the cantos, and looked at that and said, my dad was wrong. I can't be a poet on weekends. If you want to be, if you want to be a writer, you have to do it full blast, and especially if you want to write in a language that is not yours. Right. So I dropped out of medical school, was cut off, of course, by my father, moved into Shakespeare and Company to live for free. Then friends I met there said, if you want to go to America, why don't you apply to Bard College? We just graduated from there. And they were a wonderful couple. New York Jewish photographer kid and his Tex-Mexican wife. They were just this incredible, nearly mythic vision of America. And so I applied. They helped me. I got accepted. I went to my dad and said, I'm going back to college. Will you pay for it? He said, of course. Yes, but I'm going to New York. And he said, okay, it's okay. So I wound up at Bard College in, the fall of '67. And in a way, that was the big move. Then I had begun to write in English in, Luxembourg. But then at Bard, I went to see the man you mentioned already, Robert Kelly, who was the great poet in residence there at that time. And I asked him, I want to write in American. It's my fourth language. How do I do this? And he said, listen on the radio to baseball.
Yeah.
That's the best, the most lively, the most accurate, the most interestingly rhythmed language that you can get. Make your ear that way.
Right.
And so I became a Mets fan, and I still am.
A long-suffering Mets fan. But I consider you this international bohemian in a way. What drew you to the avant-garde? They seem to be, poets who were outliers and didn't want to go with the mainstream. In a way, your story rejecting, the well-trod path of medicine and things for this kind of wild life. Is that what drew you to these poets, that they didn't you know, they were rebelling, they were finding something new and authentic? And
Of course, the interesting European ones when I grew up was somebody like Gottfried Benn, you know, who had been poet, but whose first volume, Morgue, was his medical studies opening up cadavers in, you know, wow, you know, that was the new expressionism. And then the Dadas were there. So that was the lively stuff. I was never interested in the sedate stuff. I mean, I liked early Eliot when I discovered it, but I lost interest in Eliot in some way, you know, once he became more traditional and more classical, more religious, also conservative. In America, it was clearly the interesting poetries were, I found him in one book that was at the Bard Bookshop, and that was Don Allen's anthology of New American Poetry, which was 1945 to 1960. And wham, I discovered this trove of stuff that was just, you know, blew me away. So as I'm saying somewhere in a piece around Celan, as I was beginning to translate Celan and seeing the wonderful sequential odd way in which the later work develops, not as individual masterpiece poems, but as sequences, as serial poems. I was reading Jack Spicer and seeing that Jack Spicer and Robin Blazer in San Francisco in the 50s, you know, at the same time, were developing similar approaches. And so this went on. I mean, I graduated from Bard. Robert Kelly gave me the keys to the big city here by giving me the phone numbers of Paul Blackburn and Jerome Rothenberg. Mm-hmm. So then I moved to the city where I met a French writer with whom I became very close, Claude Pellieu, who lived with Mary Beach, the niece of Sylvia, in the Chelsea Hotel. So then I lived when I could afford it in the Chelsea Hotel for 69, 70. And then as New York was getting a bit rough, end of psychedelia, I moved to friends of mine who were leaving and were going to England. So then I moved to London in end of 71, early 72. And London at that moment was very exciting. A lot of younger poets who reading the same people coming out of, say, reading Charles Olson and Spicer, that whole range of material, post-beat, if you want, or, you know. So I started a magazine there. All of those things happened. And then I couldn't get a job, and I had to find a job. And it's kind of funny the way those nomadic things happen. I had a letter from Clayton Eshelman, who told me he had just turned down a job that he had been offered to teach creative writing at the University of Constantine in Algeria. Huh. So I wrote there, got the job, and 6 months later I was in a car driving, got a car from my parents, their old Volvo, and drove it into the Sahara. Went to Constantine and lived for 3 years in North Africa. And that brought a whole lot of new and interesting work. You know, you're in a place like that, you look what happened here. And what are the you know, and for me, what happened is what happened also in poetry. And so I got interested in all of that literature. I had already been roommate in Shakespeare & Company with Mohammed Khaireddin, who is a young poet like me, a bit older, had published one little book, who kind of became the major, one of the 4 or 5 major Moroccan poets of his generation. Passed unhappily already some 15 years ago. I translated him, and another book that came out 2 months ago is a book of his called Agadir. Right. On the set in the Temblor in Agadir in the 50s.
So the Shakespeare & Company, I've been to that store, but I didn't know people lived there. Do you just sort of roll up in the back of the store, or is there rooms above, or how do you live at?
Well, they have on the second floor of the store, there are a couple individual rooms with books, but they have kind of sofas there, you know, and where during the daytime the people come and sit. Right. But George Whitman used to allow. I mean, his choices were kind of odd. George was a kind of odd, you know, person. but he was also a very good-hearted man in a way. So you
Right.
talk to him and say, okay, you can stay 2 nights. You know, and a month later, he was still there, but that was okay. You helped out in the shop a bit. You did this and that, you know. And then there were readings down there. There was a little, you've been there, so
Yeah.
you knew that little fountain thing there.
Yeah.
And I gave reading there, my first public reading where I got kind of called on a bad poem I wrote for Langston Hughes. It was a celebration of Hughes. But you know, that was the very lively stuff, you know. And I keep going back. I go in every time I'm in Paris, of course.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of things seem like your advantage was that you were multilingual. That seems like you could travel and work in so many different cultures and countries. But secondly, it seems like you've always been open to surprise and risk and new things. But it's also must be tough to sustain a career as a poet for 50 years. I mean,
Well, traveling has to do with that,
right,
right?
right,
I was in Algeria, which was a totally great adventure because I got that job. I got back to London, and then I began teaching at American Air Force bases for the University of Maryland, which was, you know, the only thing. So I drive to Essex back, you know, twice, 3 times a week. So the travel was always somewhere involved with job. And then I couldn't get a job anymore in England. This was in Thatcher's horrible days.
yeah,
So I got gigs at France Culture, the French radio station in Paris, the cultural. They have most amazing station, you know, that does only cultural stuff 24 hours a day, and it's the national radio. And I eventually moved there to Paris and lived there 86, 87, again, doing all kind of programs, creating various programs. I mean, you know, the filmmaker Sam Fuller, I did a kind of oral biography of a 9 hours broadcast of Sam Fuller, having him talk, but then we had to translate it and put a
right,
French over. But anyway, you know, that stuff. And then I was invited to come to the International Iowa Writers thing in the fall of 87. And I'd been looking for a way back to the US. And Jerry Rothenberg and I had been in touch, and he was in Binghamton. And I couldn't get a job in Binghamton, but they gave me a doctoral assistantship. So that gave me a visa also again for 4 months. So I flew into Iowa, was there a few months, then drove to Binghamton, was in Binghamton a year and a half, by which time Jerry had gone to California. And he and I were beginning to do those big anthologies
right.
and translate Picasso and some other people. So I moved to California. Then I was in California for a few years teaching poet in residence at UCSD and at State University of San Diego, and where I met Nicole Perafid. And then my friend Don Bird said, there's a job going in Albany.
Ah.
You should apply.
Yep.
And so I applied, and they gave me the job, you know.
That's great. So let's talk about translation, particularly Celan. Is translating for a poet kind of like the side gig to pay the bills, like you know, a novelist freelances doing book reviews or something, or is it really something that enriches your own poetry? Does it kind of recharge your own, you know, batteries in terms of writing your own poetry, or is it strictly just something, you know, to earn some money to get to your own work?
No, money in translation, unless you do prose novels and you work 8 to 10 hours a day on that, and then you may be able to pay the rent.
Right.
I think the only 3 months I was able to pay the rent with translation was when I translated what's his name into French, and the movie Paris, Texas, Sam Shepard,
Yeah.
Hell Chronicles, and the movie came out at Cannes Festival, and I was able to get the thing translated quick enough so that they brought out the book And that paid rent for 3 or 4 months. But that's the only time this happened, right?
Right.
Poetry doesn't make that happen at any rate. No, I think translation is the best way to learn about writing already. Now, when I was teaching at Albany, I basically turned my creative writing classes into translation classes, telling the students, I ain't really interested in your dirty old condition, to quote William Burroughs. You know, you want to learn how to write, look at the great writers that you like, and then translate them. That's how you really get into.
Yeah.
For me, that was important early on because I didn't really know American English that well. I mean, you can still hear an accent in my voice, right? What happened?
You're using a lot of baseball metaphors and Mets jargon.
Now, how
Those
did
amazing Mets.
How did I get on third base? Couldn't hit a homer right off. No way. When I started looking at, when I got to Bard, I came to America with 3 books. De la Grammatologie by Derrida that had just come out, Les mots et les choses of Foucault, and Atemwende by Celan. Okay. Thinking I may wind up being a translator. Right. So at Bard in September, October 67, I translated 10 pages of the Derrida and the Foucault, sent them to New York publishers. I'm still waiting for an answer.
That won't pay the rent.
Right. So, I learned something already there. So the next year I needed to do a dissertation at Bard. So I decided to translate it Celan. And obviously I have gone on translating Celan for the next 53 years. Now the reason for that was that when in high school I heard that Totus Fugger that was maybe the most spiritual experience I ever had. And that told me that there was a use of language that was something completely other than what I knew. You know, right. It was not street spoken language. It wasn't literature either. It was something that was, you know. Right. So in that sense, I've been paying a debt to Celan for my whole life because he's the one who brought me to what I'm doing, to what became my life's work. Translation is, in that sense, you know, in relation to Celan, that lifetime work. I did a lot of other people. Early on, I translated towards French, as you mentioned. You know, I translated Mexico City Blues by Kerouac and Corso. So a lot of the beats, because I still had French well enough. A few years back, I was asked to do a Ginsberg book, and I promised Alan I would look after his thing in France after Claude Pellieu passed and so on. And I couldn't do it except I got Nicole, who is French by origin, involved in it, you know, and we translated. So I couldn't go that way any longer. I can only go into, you know, what is my language.
Right, right. So Celan, for people who are watching this who may not know, and I didn't really know his work before I looked at your collection, but a tortured soul. I mean, parents, you know, he's a German-speaking Jew. He has to go into hiding during Kristallnacht. His parents are taken away. They both die in the Holocaust. He's in a labor camp. I mean, you know, psychological, obviously emotional, deep scars. In terms of material for a poet, such a horrible, difficult life, you know, gave him the deepest reservoir from which to draw. Did his life story also draw you to him as well?
Well, as somebody, I'm born in 46, so I'm born at the other cusp of this. But obviously this was present. Luxembourg is liminal. Luxembourg was occupied by Germany, you know, and so on. And I'm working on an memoir. I don't like the term, but writing about events of that order of my youth. And one of the very specific events I wrote about has to do when I was 8 or 9 in school, in grade school. We were between classes. We were on our break. We were in the actually it was the basketball court of the town, and there were a couple of kids who grabbed a younger kid who was in my class by the legs and schlepped him across the turf, singing, 1, 2, 3, there's a jeu de capote. 1, 2, 3, there's a Jew that croaked. Wow. An old and I froze. I knew from my parents, from so on, that, you know, that stuff like that had happened. And here we are in 54, 55 maybe, and this is happening right there. That is one of the most marking experiences I had as a kid, you know, because I knew the kid. He was the son of a clothing store where my mother would take me to buy clothes, you know, my sweaters for the winter, I remember specifically. And so there was that very odd relationship. You know?
Right.
I had a number of those things. I mean, not that directly. My grandmother had a movie house, and I could go for free to see the movies, which was wonderful, you know. And I wrote about seeing an excellent movie with Marlon Brando as a German, what was it called? Something with lions, or so, who dies at the end, who's killed. So the war was very present, you know, and as already mentioned, the American Army coming every year for Patton Day. So obviously, growing up that moment, you are very much involved with this. And Celan, of course, was immediately important because the poem that was given us as the most important poem about the concentration camp empire universe, you know, was his Todesfuge.
Right.
And then as I grew into Celan and looked at it, I also saw that Celan then refused to have that poem published again, anthologized again, and investigating, beginning to read on him in the late 60s, because it took a long time for there really to be a secondary literature, a secondary literature around him. You discovered that the misuse that poem had been put to in Germany, i.e., it was anthologized as a kind of proof we have overcome, you know, the past. But if you looked at the questions that the students were asked about the poem in the back of the teacher's manual, they were all about the aesthetics of the poem, not one question about the content, you know.
Yeah.
And the major critic who wrote the first big review of it said, this is an absolutely astounding and marvelous poem, totally fantastic, surreal images, no connection to the real.
Yeah.
Turned out that that man had been an SS officer in World War II.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Yeah.
So,
but
anyway, I mean, I grew up and out of that kind of space, you know, intellectual, physical, historical space. And getting out of Europe in that sense, it comes to me now, was also very important. Schlepping Celan with me, because the American space felt a very different open space where you could breathe more easily, you know, from on the road, you know, whereas that in Europe, I felt in, you know, in a swamp, you know, up to my ass, sunk in, and you could only tread along very narrowly already tread paths, you know, you couldn't race out of that muck.
Right. But talk about, and you have a long opening essay in this collection, Memory Rose into Threshold Speech, that is powerful. But here was somebody who, you know, Holocaust survivors face all kinds of emotional, psychological, and he certainly did. And then he also had this terrible challenge and charge of plagiarism from the wife of a poet friend, and then he's hospitalized in psychiatric hospital and deep depression, and ends up at the age of 50 drowning himself in the Seine. But he's still productive throughout all this. He writes hundreds of poems. Just talk about his you know, life story and how he was able to overcome seeing so much horror and still be one of the great poets of the modern era.
Celan comes from Chernovitz, a little town that was, yes, that was multilingual. In those days, I mean, until 1918, 2 years before his birth, it was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire.
Right.
Then it became part of Romania. Although the Romanian nationality didn't have much to do with Celan. His parents were Jews from that area, from always, with connections to the Hasidic Jews further up in Poland, so on and so on. The languages spoken were multiple. You know, obviously Romanian is spoken in the street as now we're Romanian. The cultured Jewish people spoke German and saw German culture, the Goethe culture, classical German culture as core. His father, who was buying and selling in town, would probably use Yiddish even more, you know.
Right.
And then there was Ukrainian around, you know, that, by the way, now it is part of Ukraine. And for a while, he was part of the Soviet Union. You know, Celan actually had a Soviet passport for a couple of years. So he grew up there, wanted to study medicine, came to France. The Kristallnacht you mentioned that was the night he first left his hometown, took a train to Berlin to go down to Paris, and that was the night of Kristallnacht. So he has in a poem, he talks of the fires that are already from yesterday. He saw the smoke already from yesterday rising. Obviously, he had the fate. He doesn't speak of it. He's one thing that is very different with him in relation to other survivors, who very often, as writers, keep repeating the same story. This is what the story of their life is, that story of survival. Celan doesn't. Celan in 44, late 44, maybe early 45, after he hears of his parents' death, writes the Todesfuge as really, and he's called it that. It's the homage to his mother, and it is the monument, the funeral monument for his mother. Then he studies out there a bit in Chernovitz, but leaves for Bucharest and becomes a translator from Russian into Romanian, from Romanian into, you know, while going on writing in German. He sees the Iron Curtain coming, so he walks through edges of Hungary into Austria, and is in Vienna for 7-8 months, where he has a great love affair with Ingeborg Bachmann, who is kind of the, you know. Then he goes, but he leaves there, goes to Paris, and I can imagine that hearing German, Austria, Vienna at that moment, that is Orson Welles' The Third Man.
Right.
That is exactly that, you know. And then he lives in Paris all this time, meets this wonderful woman, Giselle Celan-Lestrange, who becomes his wife. And he writes, he is absolutely determined from the beginning on to write. Later on, the poems become smaller. You know, we already mentioned the psychiatric things and so on. We can talk more about that. But he's accused of, oh, he's going crazy. His writing becomes smaller and more, you know, obscure and so on. He's lost it.
Right.
You look at the work, he simply has completely revolutionized his own thinking about poetry and is writing a new kind of poetry and is writing more and more. The last years of his life, rather than what the Germans often called him verstummen, falling silent, he becomes way more. He writes more. He writes nearly a poem a day.
Right.
You know, 900 poems really of his are there, you know, for somebody who started in 20.
Yeah. So, I mean, all poets are magpies, taking a bit of everything, obviously, you know, experience and everything they read and take in and observe. But was there any merit to those plagiarism charges? Because I know you investigate it.
No, that was total bull. This is a woman who is really an awful person. Celan helped her husband shortly after he got to Paris in the late 40s, very early 50s, to translate himself back into German. He was an Alsatian. He had written some in German, some in French. So, but Celan then was helping him. He died unhappily right then from a cancer. His widow tried to get more and more of him published, right? But by the mid-50s, Celan had already also began publishing and was becoming famous. And she got jealous and she decided that to claim that Ivan Goll was really the great poet and Celan was just ripping off her husband. Mm. So the way she was doing that, she was saying those poems you see that he published in his first book in 53, 54, they were written after my husband's poems here, and they draw on that. She actually faked some of her husband's manuscripts to get for instance. But it was easily provable because the poems that Celan had in that volume, he had already published in a volume that was published in Vienna and that were written in the middle 40s. So, you know, there was no contest.
But that deeply wounded him, right? I mean, that set him spiraling into depression.
Especially in 1960, she reiterated that and she got the German magazine to publish it. And there was like, you know, there was an anti-Semitism that was always there in Germany that remained, you know, even if it was very, very hidden. Celan would point it out, you know, and people would call him a paranoid. And as I wrote in a number of places, you know, to quote William Burroughs, a paranoid is a man who knows the facts. Yeah. And in Celan's case, this was very clearly so, you know, as I already mentioned that as officer who wrote the criticism of his Todesfuge and so on. So Celan was, yes, his mental health was, you know, that double whammy. The fact of being a survivor, losing the parents, being an only child, being on his own. Two, those accusations by a Jewish woman, by the way, Mrs. Goll, Claire Goll, whom he had helped as a young man, or he, you know, her husband, you know, very much, deeply, deeply wounded him. And so, yes, he has psychiatric problems. He goes into psychiatric care. And eventually it is too much. And at the age of 50, in 1970, he goes into the Seine. I like to say he jumps off a poem because he goes to the Pont Mirabeau, which is, of course, also the name of a great poem by Guillaume Apollinaire.
Right.
You know, and goes over from there.
Because on his desk, didn't he have a page open to a poem that kind of foreshadowed this type of death?
It was not a poem. It was the book that was open was a biography of Friedrich Hölderlin by someone. And there was a quote by another German writer, by Fichte, that said, sometimes this genius goes dark. You know, it was that sense, you know, that there was a darkness, the darkness became too much. And, you know,
I mean, remarkable output and depth for somebody who was only 50. I mean, a lot of poets come into their own after that age. Now you've carried, like you said, you carried him across the Atlantic. You spent 50 years. Does it feel sad that you're done with Celan? Or are you glad to sort of put an end to that chapter of your life? And
no, I'm happy. I mean, I didn't spend the 53 years working on him. You know, I did that at Bard. Later on in London, I wasn't doing much. People wanted to publish that book, but they couldn't because the rights were not available yet. So it was complicated. But then when I was in Algeria, I reworked. It was funny, sitting in an oasis in the Sahara, reworking those poems, trying to say, oh, they were too tight, let me do something else with them. Then putting it aside because I got interested in translating other materials, Arab materials, you know, some early Arab poetry. And I translated all those other books, you know. I remember later on I translated Jabez, Blanchot from French and so on. I would go back to Celan and all of a sudden the idea was there that, well, maybe I can do at least the collected later works. And I finished those. And eventually, you know, they were published in individual volumes in California by Sun and Moon Press. And then one day I was sitting here and saying, I should put those together and somebody should put that out as one book. And I thought, well, who could do that? Well, a big New York publisher who's interested in translation is, you know, FSG, because Jonathan Galassi is a great translator himself. And one night I took my courage in two hands or two fingers and, you know, typed an email and sent it off and immediately, you know, would you be interested? And I had an immediate answer from Jonathan. Yes, come and talk to me.
That's great.
Know? So it was the easiest sale I ever did for, for a book. And then he got me a year later when the book came out. He said, why don't you do the early work now? Because then you'd have all done. I said, oh my God. The ideal date was there, 2020, the centenary, but that would mean I had to translate as much as done over 35 years in 3.5 years, you know.
Right.
And
so how do you give yourself so many pages or poems a day, or do you go in spurts and then set it aside, or it has to be methodical if you have to hit those kinds of deadlines?
For this book, I basically just put aside my own work, sat down every day and translate it. I mean, I go to my notebook and write a poem in, or I recorded poems walking down along the Narrows, which became a little book called The Cormorants, because there were all the cormorants out there who are my favorite birds. And but basically, yes, I just got up in the morning and was like an you know, basic daily job. Sat down and translated a poem or two, you know, and then turned around towards this side of my desk.
And here's the other book, the City Full of Voices. I appreciate your publisher sent it to me, but is Kelly still at Bard? Is he?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, he's at Bard. That is the second volume, as you know. Let me show you the first one.
Aha.
Yeah, the first one, which
I'm putting these two together. These two.
Well, I could hold the first Celan and that one together, and we have about 2,000 pages there. Something of that order. The first book was all of the essays that Kelly did, and this book was essays on Kelly. I think Kelly, who is one of the most formidable American poets, I mean, he has close to 100 books now.
Wow.
You know, he moved from Brooklyn to Annandale and has taught at Bard College since about 1965 or 64. I don't know. It was before my time. I came in 67. He was there. And we celebrated his 85th birthday. Nicole did a video that is available on, that you can watch, that the Poetry Project, we did a celebration there. So he's been a close friend, you know, over the years after working together on Celan. And I mean, if there's a New York poet who should be a New York State poet, here is one. I put in my vote for that.
Okay, we are going to be revisiting that soon. We'll check in with you.
Yep.
Finally, I guess we're coming up on an hour. This has been delightful. I can't think of how you're doing in quarantine, because you are somebody who, you know, travels the world, who goes to a lot of literary conferences, poetry gatherings. Your wife's a performance artist. The two of you perform a lot. How are you handling this quarantine life?
I was talking with Paul Oster some weeks ago on the phone and said, well, for us old geezers, this is perfect. We're just sitting home and do what we like doing. On our desk, we write, you know, and then we go out and walk a bit, you know, and then come back. Nicole and I have also, we're supposed to go to Europe for a big event and an exhibition of Nicole's work in February. But we've been going to the beaches here, in the Rockaways, and actually doing little performances and filming them there. So the performance work goes on. you know, you can do it with a camera on a beach at 8 in the morning. There's nobody around.
Right.
So, you know, we keep busy. I mean, I'm, you know, working on that prose book I mentioned earlier, and I'm putting together another book of poems, given that birds and bird watching was so important. I have a book now getting ready that's called A Feather of Many Birds. So, you know, just keep doing. And you also travel by reading. And I'm still, you know, a reader, you know, look around. There is, you know, there's a few hundred books in here that I haven't read, I confess, you know. And so I can get to those.
Right. So you mentioned you're into your 70s now, right? I mean, poets don't retire. You retired as a professor, but do you feel like you're as creative now? I know, you know, I'm 61. I don't have as much energy working late at night as I used to, but do you feel you're in this period of creativity just as much as you were in your 40s or 50s or 30s?
Yes, I was very lucky. I got very sick in my early 60s. I had Hep C. So I stopped drinking and I stopped smoking. And all of a sudden, with Nicole's help and, you know, doing things, we've been doing a lot of working out also.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel physically in better shape than I felt from 25 to 65. You know? Simply because of I was forced to do something if I didn't want to call it quits completely.
Right.
I've always been an early morning person anyway. I get up at 5, but my best writing times are, say, 5 to 10. That's why I asked you to call me at 11, because that way I had already my morning work done.
That's great.
Now I can do housework or whatever is needed, and, you know, we can go out in the afternoon.
Right.
So no, I feel pretty good at this point. I mean, obviously we're stuck in this weird crisis. Happily, it gets reduced to one virus. The other one is leaving office very soon.
Yes, yes. But that feeling and the descriptions of that Shakespeare and Company, or, you know, in the poetry scene, the late nights, you know, creative minds, sparks flying, you know, wine flowing. You must miss that. I mean, I do miss the gatherings, you know.
Yeah, no, some of the gatherings I miss, but I am not that worried, you know. Some gatherings happen in intense ways. Another little book I did 2 years ago is
Yes.
Adonis and I, you know, the Syrian poet,
Right.
who has been on the Nobel list for 10 years, but never gets there for some reason. You know, we gathered a couple of years ago in very intensely, talked and recorded it, and there was another book, so that intensity were there. We were together in Abu Dhabi in late February, just before the COVID hit, you know, to celebrate his 90th, you know, and talked again a lot, you know. So, okay, so I can take it until next, you know, he and I can Zoom also from time to time and gab, you know. So it's, I mean, at one level, it is what it is. It opens up different spaces, different ways of moving about things. And it also helps clear out what I don't really need to be at that reading or at that gab fest. You know, I can actually
Get to bed early.
You know, get to bed early, you read something I haven't gotten to for a long time, you know.
Right. And I also want to congratulate you. I know you're very proud of your son, Miles, who's a rising filmmaker. He's been getting attention. I know we mentioned he's working on several projects. So you both live in Brooklyn, I guess, huh? He's also...
Yes, I mean, the whole family, you know, Joseph, who is a film producer, lives close by here in what I call Sorrentino-stan, Bay Ridge, because that's where Gil was from. And Miles lives up in Greenpoint, you know, and Yes, I mean, the only regret we really have is that we can't just drive up and go in and hug and sit down and, have meals.
Right.
That's a shame. But yes, and he's busy. He has many projects. He has his second feature just came out, Dreamland with Margot Robbie. You can catch it, you can stream it.
Right.
I think in the Midwest, it's also in some of those newly reopened drive-ins, which is kind of a wonderful way to see it. Of course, now the weather is getting bad for drive-ins, but
Right.
it's so one keeps busy. And yes, he has his mother's visual eye, and he likes writing as I do also. So Miles is going. Joe is doing his stuff as producer. Nicole is editing a video for the the poetry project's New Year's Day
Mm,
that we made.
that's great.
So
I hope when we're able to resume in-person events at the Writers Institute that you'll come back to Albany and do a program with us.
I certainly love to, Paul.
So congratulations on this great volume. It's the collected early works of Paul Celan, Memory Rose into Threshold Speech, out by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and also this collection of essays that you edited on Robert Kelly, A City Full of Voices, along with your own, there you go, Adonice and your own
Fox Trails.
yeah, Fox Trails, your memoir, not your memoir.
No, these are poems. These are poems around foxes that go back to the 70s. Later tales when I bring the fox as a kind of cousin of coyote to America, and then it has a couple of those prose pieces about growing up in Luxembourg. And I was published by the first English language publisher in Luxembourg.
That's great.
So I'm still nomadic.
You nomadic and eclectic. Pierre Joris, it's been a great pleasure, and I look forward to welcoming you back to the Writers Institute in Albany sometime soon.
Thank you, Paul. Say hello to everybody. Greet everybody. Much love to all you guys.
I will. Thank you very much, Pierre.